If your tracks don't sound professional and you just don't understand why, it's a number of super subtle things that we're going to cover today. We're going to completely break down a trap, hip hop, kind of pop track that I made that was actually sold to an artist and is doing very well. And we're going to look at all the elements and all the post-processing. That way it'll be easier for you to kind of pinpoint where you might be falling short and possibly give you guys some inspiration on some changes to make and some processing to do and whatnot. Everything that we're about to cover in here, I cover in a complete start to finish course that I just dropped. It's called 30-Day EDM Producer. It's 77 modules. It's over 17 hours of content. It's everything I've learned from Icon Collective, working with some of the biggest artists in EDM, producing from 10 years. I'm taking all that and basically packaging it into one package and selling it to you guys for dirt cheap. The coolest part is if you buy it, you actually get half off Ableton Live, as well as half off a number of other plugins as well. Definitely worth checking out. Highly recommend it. We also have a community where we do track reviews. You can hop in and ask questions. Definitely a cool thing to join. Let's get into the track. All right, so we're going to cover this track in its entirety, basically a complete breakdown of the post-processing, spatial effects, layering, everything having to do with this track. So this track is a little bit of a success story because this artist actually messaged me to produce it for him. Produced it, took me probably about 6 hours, start to finish, and it actually sold for about $3,500. So it doesn't always work out like that. That's a rare situation, but that goes to show that with these skills we're about to go over, you can produce a track for an artist and make some good money on it, or produce your own tracks. So first, we're going to take a listen through some parts of it.
Ain't no way. Yeah. Ain't no way. Yeah. They don't as bad as me. They don't as bad as me. I could put miles in shit. Ain't nobody proud as me. Y'all gotta sell your soul to stay relevant. I stay on top of the hell of it. Buck teeth with veneers, rip 'em out souvenirs. Bloody mouth, where's the light? Except when you play with your life. Your concerns are political. I be hitting straight critical. Always trying to keep it biblical.
Sacrifice, what?
That don't work on me. That don't work on me. Seen it on the streets. Beautiful women ain't women. Everybody do what they feelin'. New place, blood on the ceiling. Last in the trick ain't killing. That don't work on me. That don't work on me. Seen it.
All right, so there's some additional parts, but you get the idea. It's kind of like a trap, pop track, I guess you could call it. So we're going to kind of go through this one section at a time, and I'm going to explain what I did and why I did it. So first, you'll notice how things are organized over here. There's a lot of room for interpretation on how you organize your groups. This is a common way that I do it, that I've seen other people do it. Basically, when you're grouping your things, you need to think, what all needs to be affected in the same manner? And for instance, like our first group up here are drums. So in order to make everything sound cohesive, so like cohesive volume levels, cohesive grit and warmth to it, that's when group processing would come in. So if we take all these drums that might be from different sample packs, might be have different dynamics, different transients, and we process them together, it's going to glue them all together and make them sound like they're all kind of coming from the same drum set, if you will. So that's why I always group my drums together, because I'll do some light group processing, again, some light glue compression, nothing really crazy here, some side chaining. We'll dive back into the drums in a second, but then we have our low end. So I always put my low end in its own group because it kind of plays by its own rules. Low-end frequencies, your sub-frequencies, kind of act differently than your mids or your tops. It's the lowest, loudest frequency, and it's also needing to be side-chained to the kick. So that's why I always group my low-end frequencies and have them kind of be their own thing so I can process them together. Then vocals. So vocals and mids. You might be asking, why wouldn't I group vocals in and mids? That's because this track is vocal-driven. So we want our mids. So we have like our violins, we have our synths, we have everything happening in the mid-range. Yet we want the vocal to sit on top of that. So again, this is a situation where we would group them separate. That way we can either make the vocal louder or sidechain the mids a little bit so the vocal's standing out more. So that's why in this situation, on a vocal-driven track, we want the vocals by themselves, typically. Then we have effects. So this is everything sitting at the far bottom, like the little sweeps, little risers, little ear candy kind of stuff. So starting out with our drums group up here.
That is me.
The first track we have up here is backing tops. And these are very subtle, very far pushed behind with reverb and turn down top end elements. So like some percussive type elements. The reason I did this is because anytime you push something super far back, it gives you a lot more dimension. So not only do we have our stuff that's way up front, like the vocals and the drums, now we have a deep mix. We have a sound stage going on. So very subtle, very quiet, super heavy reverb, turned down backing tops. So it's honestly like barely audible, but little stuff like this in the grand scheme of things can really add up and kind of add to your track. This should be in effects, but it's just a little sweep. Sometimes things like that make their ways into different groups for processing and whatnot. Then we have our top end elements. So this is our main top end elements. And when I say top end, I'm talking about hi-hats, rides, open hats, shakers, all that kind of stuff. So notice this is something that I made and then I consolidated, so I froze it and flattened it. And notice how kind of crazy everything is here. So a lot of stereo imaging, so a lot of moving from side to side, a lot of movement here. And there's probably about 5 different top end elements here. So one thing I see newer producers struggle with a lot is doing like the 8th note hi-hat. Super boring, super robotic, super repetitive. So something like this where it's keeping the groove. We have 4 or 5 different elements. It's got some movement. It's moving left to right. And it's got some swing and some groove to it. Really kind of helps the track like lively up. Like this sounds just like a real percussive loop. Then we have an open hat down here. Then we have our snare. So snare is pretty straightforward. The snare is one thing that I don't mess with a lot because it's kind of like the metronome of the track. Like you can always expect the snare to be in its place sounding relatively similar. Again, standard snare, and this is the thing about stuff like this is a little bit of glue compression, that's it. You don't have to go crazy with processing. You don't have to have a huge chain on there. Just pick the right snare. That's a big thing I'm a big component of is pick the right sample. You know what I'm saying? Or make the right sample. If you're having to process something and just like completely tear it up, odds are it's not the right sample. So I picked a good snare, this is a decap snare, and left it alone. And it's funny because there's all those memes online about like, your snare sounds like shit. How do you get your snare to sound good mixing your snare? I'll tell you how. Pick a good snare and leave it the fuck alone. It's that simple. That's really all it is. It's compressed a little bit. Then we have some more top end elements here. So a shaker. Notice the groove on this shaker. So going back to what I was saying about like the hi-hats, the repetitive. This is shuffled, so these are quieter than the others. So it's simulating like a shaker and then a softer hit. Shaker and then a softer hit. Again, adds groove to the track. Nice little percussive shot here. Little background snap. Little accent snare. So you'll notice all 3 of these are decap samples. I typically like to pick samples either from the same artist or from the same sample pack. That way they sound cohesive. We know everything's good. Decap, for those of you who don't know, is like a hip-hop trap producer. This is kind of like a hip-hop trap pop kind of track. So decap snares, and this is just a little background like accent snare. It's panned a little to the right. Again, we're just kind of pushing it out of the middle. And then we have a couple snare rolls in here somewhere. So yeah, just a little snare roll. Snare roll has a little bit of a pitch dive to it. Little touches like that, like a little subtle pitch dive, all that stuff kind of adds up. So that's our drums or our top end elements. Creates a really good foundation for the track. You'll notice our kick isn't in here, and we'll explain why that is in just a second. And then again, the group processing, a little bit of cutting out the lows. Again, our kick's not in here, so we don't need anything that's not your sub bass or your kick. You don't need this stuff down here. You don't need 100 and below. You can really chop most of it at 150, and it's going to give you a cleaner mix because down here we only want one thing. We want our sub bass or our kick switching off. There's a lot of phase issues that can happen down here because a sub is essentially a sine wave. So if 2 things are playing at the same time and the sines are, the polarity is reversed, it'll cancel them out and it'll make your sub disappear. So keep your low end clean. Pretty simple. So there's no reason why we shouldn't filter this at 150. And then a little bit of glue compression, glue everything together. Glue compression is basically a way to kind of make everything, give it kind of the same dynamics and make it the same volume level. Again, subtle. We're looking for something subtle here. Not a whole lot of gain reduction. And then Chain Shaper is actually a side chaining tool. So this allows us to, instead of sidechain compressing, doing a sidechain volume automation. So this ducks for our kick. So moving on to our low end, our kick is living in this group. I don't always do that, but again, it's a low end frequency. So let's hear what we got going on here. So we got a really punchy kick. I clipped this kick. So anytime you clip something, you can add some color to it and make it loud. We wanted this kick to kind of bang, so we put a clipper on it. Just some subtle clipping, just catching the peaks there. So for the sub, Sublab is my favorite thing to use for sub. It's a synthesizer that's dedicated completely to subs. Sounds super good. Highly recommend. I don't think it's too expensive. I think it's like 50 bucks. So yeah, a good sub line there that matches with the melody of our track. Sidechain, so this is sidechain compression from the kick. And then erosion on the sub. So this is something I do quite often. And it gives it that nice razzle at the top. Almost sounding like your sub is blown out. It's super common. So just a little bit of erosion on the tip there. And then I monoed it out because we want our lowest frequencies in mono, so completely in the middle. We don't want stereo imaging on them at all. So that's our low end. And as far as group processing goes, we have a clipper again. So just kind of clip everything, catch the peaks. Pro Q. So one area I really like to address in pretty much any mix, especially in low end, is the mud range. And the mud range typically sits between 250 and 300 hertz. It's this kind of sound. It's basically like the sound, it sounds like mud. So if someone's covering their mouth talking like this, it's that boominess. We don't want to cut it out too much, but we want to reduce it a little bit, and it really kind of brightens up our mix. Another thing it does is it kind of draws separation from the low end to the rest of the track. So I typically address the mud frequencies here. Another thing you'll see me doing that might seem counterintuitive is cutting out the lows. Anything below 40 hertz you can't really hear. And the problem with having it down here is that if this sub is peaking up here, that's hitting our ceiling. So this is hitting our ceiling before this is. And so we want this to be the loudest part of our track. So in order to do that, I just cut out 14 and below. You can't hear it. It's just cutting that stuff out and reducing problems for us. Then we have a little bit of a dip up here, just removing some of the high-end frequencies, mid-highs. We don't need them on our sub. Next, getting into the Vox, the vocals here. So I froze this vocal chain because it will make my computer crash. But basically, it's pretty simple. So a compressor, a de-esser, and Fab Filter is the best for this kind of stuff. Light compression, light DS soothes, so this tames transients like rogue peaks. A corrective EQ. Mag EQ is to boost air, so you can boost the highest frequencies on it. And then just a little bit of glue compression, glue it together, a little bit of saturation, and a little bit of parallel delay.
They don't as bad as me. They don't as bad as me. I could put miles in shit. Ain't nobody proud as me. Y'all gotta sell your soul to stay right. They don't as bad as me. They don't as bad as me. I could put miles in.
So this is without.
They don't as bad as me. They don't as bad as me.
And this is with.
They don't as bad as me. They don't as bad as me.
So besides for the fact that it's crackling because my CPU's freaking out, you can hear it really pushes it forward and brings life to it. And that's because, again, the compressor, just some light compression so we can turn everything back up. De-essers remove that harsh, that T's and S's. Just remove them a little bit so it's not like piercing the listener's ears. Just that kind of stuff. Soothe, this is a dynamic resonant peak suppressor.
They don't as bad as me.
So if you have like some rogue peak, it'll automatically duck it. Super cool tool. Pro Q3, so again, like we talked about earlier, we don't need the low frequencies on this vocal. They're just gonna compete and take up space where our sub bass and our kick lives. So we dip that. Then we boost the air. So Mag EQ, this is a great one for boosting the super high frequencies. What it does is you can't hear 40K, but it drags the entire rest of the track up. And it does this thing where it just brightens it up, which is great for vocals. It's a very common vocal trick. Like glue compression.
They don't as bad as me. They don't.
Black box is an analog saturator, like a analog emulated saturator. A little bit of color, a little bit of grit, almost like a preamp. Again, very subtle. We don't want to go too heavy with this. And then a little bit of delay.
They don't as bad as me. They don't as bad as me.
This is actually delay throw, so at a certain point we are doing like a throw here.
What? That don't work on me.
So when we get to the chorus, now to add like size and dimension to this vocal, we're going to crank up the delay and kind of give the listeners this experience. So that's the vocal chain. Nothing too crazy. I hope the takeaway from this is that you really don't have to go too nuts to make something that sounds pretty good. This is just a little reversed vocal reverb swell. So basically this trick is pretty cool. What you do is you put some heavy reverb on a little end of a track, like something like this. You put super heavy reverb on it, move it to another track, freeze it, flatten it, and then reverse it, and then you get something like this. Really leads you into the next part of like the next bar or the next part of the vocal. Then coming down to our mid. So there's a lot of stuff going on here. We have this chord progression. So this is kind of like our motif here, or like our theme of the track is this pluck sound. And one thing that I'll point out is that the entire mids group is structured off of this progression right here. So what I did is I got a MIDI chord progression, and I basically repurposed it and restructured it in like 7 different ways to fill out this entire mid section. So it's all essentially, give or take, the same thing. So we have like in a chord progression version, in the pluck version, in like a kind of like vocal background sound. So I really like to use Native Instruments stuff for this. You can get some really high-end sounds out of them. Stuff like this is output, or exhale, so it's a really good vocal engine. This one's frozen, but this is basically just like a pluck preset. A lot more high quality than you might get out of like a Ableton stock device, in my opinion. This, just a little bit of OTT. So for those of you who don't know, OTT means over the top. It's a multi-band compression preset that really like pushes something to the front of the mix and makes it loud. So a little bit of OTT to kind of just make this pluck loud. Let it sit at the top as long as you can get it to. Again, like we talked about, cutting out these lows, you don't need these low frequencies in here. The Haas effect. So the Haas effect is actually a delay that delays one speaker just milliseconds from the other, and it makes something wide. So we have so much going on in the middle of the mix. We have the vocals are in the middle of the mix, the sub bass, the kick, the snare. So for our plucks, we're going to kind of push them to the side. So if you listen closely, you can hear they're kind of pushed out. Then we have Fuser, which is this is a really cool automatic sidechaining tool. So it sidechains certain frequencies. So basically what it's doing is when the vocals are playing in certain spots, only in certain frequencies, it's going to duck this pluck just a little bit so the vocal can shine. A little Pro Q, just some adjusting stuff. All these are sidechained to the kick. So we get a little bit of ducking, different amounts, a little bit of ducking on each of them. Then just a little bit of delay, and this is like some movement and automation filter on it. As far as other elements go, we have the ARP. So again, this is the same notes as up here. They're just repurposed as an ARP. So I took this chord progression here, made it an arpeggio, and now we have this track. And anytime you do something like this where you repurpose something, it's going to sound cohesive because it's cut from the same cloth. Then we have the synth, which I believe was actually from the artist. Kind of just like a background synth. Ear candy, so it's keeping everything from getting stagnant. Then the violin. Again, complete control violin. So there's like a low violin, and then we have our top violin here. So this is kind of a nice deviation from the rest of the track where we have the plucks. It gives us kind of like an orchestral break right here. So we have the synth strings, we have the low violin and the higher violin. So we're giving it kind of like an organic feel with all these sounds. And notice the low violin is panned to the left, high is panned to the right. When I'm doing stuff like this, what I'm trying to do is emulate like an orchestra. So if we had an orchestra, we're sitting in a room listening to them, one guy would be on the left, one guy would be on the right. And so I'm kind of emulating that. And so they're panned a little different. So you get that nice orchestral kind of background sound going on. And then as far as on our mids group goes, track spacer. So again, we want our vocal to shine. We don't want our vocal to compete with all these mid-range elements. These are supposed to be in the back. So we're sidechaining just, this one's really good too. You can sidechain just certain frequencies. And we're targeting this area. That way, when these are in the way of the vocal, these are ducking just a little bit.
That don't work on me. Seen it on the streets.
So it's very subtle, and it's supposed to be very subtle. It's at a super low ratio. But when the vocal comes in, we want it to turn down in that area just a little bit so it's not cluttering up the vocal. And then again, some side chaining to the vocal. So this is kind of a second take on that.
That don't work on me.
This one is not so much for when they're playing at the same time as to where this one is turning down everything when the vocal is playing, and then it's allowing it to play a little bit louder where there's no vocals, if that makes sense. Then our effects, so a little background noise here. This is just ear candy stuff. Little laser. Just little ear candy, like placing stuff like this. It's all turned down very low and it's tucked in the back. So it's not really even noticeable, but it's just a subtle change, a subtle change and a subtle rhythmic variation. That's pretty much it. You know, it might look complicated, but if I had to summarize this project, I would say, find out what your motif is. So find out what the vibe or like the melody or whatever your track is. Find a way to repurpose it with different instruments in different ways, and you could literally create like an entire deal like this. And then a little group processing. Coming down to our master, I mastered this with Ozone. My computer absolutely will not record if this is on. But again, I always like to circle back and address the mud section. Like you can hear that's not a sound we need in there. It's not contributing to anything. It's just kind of causing mud and muddying up our track. So I typically address this because when everything sums up, everything adds, it's introducing a little bit more mud, even though we already did this on a group. Then we have a little bit of chopping out the lows. We don't need this again. It's just going to cause problems for us. Goldfoss. So Goldfoss basically evens everything out. You put it on your master and it just kind of makes slight adjustments on the EQ to kind of boost and cut things. Again, super subtle.
Beautiful women ain't women. Everybody do what they feeling.
Just makes things a little bit more expensive. Pro L is like a super good limiter. So we just ran everything into a limiter so we can get it loud.
Beautiful women ain't women. Everybody do what they feel.
-5 dB gain reduction is fine.
Beautiful women ain't women. Everybody do what they feeling.
And then this one, newfangled punctuate. This preset, what it allows you to do is after we've compressed everything and we've manipulated everything and processed it, our kick can get buried and kind of get like doled out. This will reintroduce the kick and kind of bring back the punch that is being doled with all the processing and the EQing and everything. This is kind of a hip hop vibe, so we want the kick to bang. And then just span. This is actually a free one just to kind of see. It's a meter, so it doesn't actually do anything, but you can see where everything's sitting. Basically, what I use this for is to make sure that there's no stereo imaging down here at the bottom and that everything's sitting in the right place up here. So there's like a certain shape we're looking for here. So I really hope that helped you guys. Again, if you found this helpful, I cover literally all these techniques in great depth in the course. I highly recommend it. If you sign up, you get half off Ableton, half off all your favorite plugins. It's a no-brainer. Just in buying Ableton alone, the courses cost less than what you'll save on half on Ableton. And you get over 17 hours of content, 77 modules. So highly recommend. In 30 days, you'll be able to produce something like this no problem, work with artists, release for yourself, petition to play shows, all that good stuff. So thank you guys for watching. If you have any questions or anything, let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.